Hello and welcome to Theology Matters. This is Dr. John Clark, and today we want to continue our study on the Sermon on the Mount. And last time we left off in a very key section, which really sets the stage, if you will, for the rest of Jesus' message. And that starts in chapter 5, verse 17, and goes through part of chapter 7. And what we have in this section is Jesus explaining the importance of true righteousness. And this is righteousness from God's perspective, not from man's perspective. And this is why many have probably rightly said that a great summary verse of the Sermon on the Mount is found in Matthew chapter 5, verse 20, which reads this: "For I say to you that unless your righteousness exceeds the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees, you will by no means enter the kingdom of heaven." And so very important distinction, which would have gotten the attention of Jesus's listeners, because the Pharisees were viewed as the most righteous people in society, and they gave up the most. They seemed to observe pretty tenaciously the Mosaic law, and so that would have been a very shocking statement to them. And one of the things that Jesus says in verse 17, as we can kind of pick up in this section now, he says, "Don't think that I came to destroy the law or the prophets. I did not come to destroy, but to fulfill." Many of the accusations against Jesus in his lifetime was that he was, he hung out with sinners. He was a glutton. He was a drinker. He didn't observe all of these important external rites of righteousness. And Jesus was not coming in and communicating a lawlessness. What Jesus was coming in and communicating was an actual true understanding of what true righteousness was, according to the God who authored the Bible, the law, the God who is righteous by character. And so when he uses this word fulfill, he uses a Greek word plerao, which means to make full an empty vessel or to fulfill or complete something. The word itself is used about 90 times in the New Testament. 17 of them, ironically enough, are found in the book of Matthew. Additionally, the word in Matthew is included typically in the phrase fulfilled, which was spoken by the Lord, or fulfilled, which was spoken by the prophet. In fact, 12 of the 17 uses are tied into one of those two phrases. And so it really provides us with a key term in Matthew's interpretation of the first advent of Jesus Christ, because from the purpose or perspective of exposition, what it does is it features this completion of what God began in Israel's history under Moses and the prophets. And then from the perspective of biblical theology, it featured the fulfillment of the dispensation of law. And so this is why it's such a key verse in the Sermon on the Mount. And then in conjunction with Matthew's purpose, showing that Jesus Christ is the completion of what God began in Israel's history. And so one of the things we recognize about the history of Israel is they never had assumed or fulfilled their responsibilities when they accepted the Mosaic covenant. And so Jesus thus assumes this collective responsibility as their representative under law, and then all that the Lord commanded, he did. And this is so key in understanding from a perspective for the nation of Israel, that Jesus' death would be the necessary death to enact the new covenant blessings during Israel's earthly kingdom. And thus, with the resources of the new covenant, the law would be written on their hearts. The Jewish remnant would then be equipped and disposed toward valuing and keeping the righteous standard of the law in a God-honoring way. And not only that, but it's also through his death and resurrection that one can be declared righteous by God when they simply put their faith in Jesus. And this is what Jesus describes to Nicodemus as being born again in John chapter 3. And so when we get to verse 20, this key verse, to this key interpretive key to the Sermon on the Mount, we got to understand that Jesus's audience questioned in their minds whether the righteousness of the Pharisees was sufficient to enter the kingdom. And in this sermon and in what follows, Christ not only rejected the Pharisaic interpretation of the law, but he also demanded a righteousness that exceeded the Pharisees' righteousness, thereby rejecting the entire Pharisaic system. So the righteousness required to enter the kingdom had to be greater than the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees, a perfect righteousness that God alone can provide. And so in this next section, as Jesus builds this argument, he's going to completely explain not only the letter of the law, but also the proper internal motivation underlying the law. And thus, it's going to give a full and complete understanding of God's righteous standard. And this standard, when heard and understood, should cause complete terror and bewilderment for the average person, because they realize they can never measure up. And if they realize that, they're one step closer to obtaining the righteousness God demands, because then they'll look outside of themselves to God's solution to their righteousness issue, which is the perfect life, death, and resurrection of his dear son. And so in this next section, Jesus is going to contrast 6 rabbinical interpretations, some taken from the Mishnaic writings, and it's the interpretations of the Torah, God's law. And he's going to contrast God's interpretation of the Torah with the rabbinical interpretation of the Torah. And the Pharisees and the other Jewish religious leaders of the day had lowered the standard of the law by simply emphasizing external compliance. And so God is interested in true righteousness, again, which emanates from within and can only be executed when one is rightly relating to the Lord by faith. And so this first faulty interpretation by the rabbis is found in verses 21 through 26, and it relates to murder. And so Jesus says, you have heard that it was said. In fact, you're going to hear this phrase used in this section. You've heard that it was said. Well, said by who? Said by the rabbis, said by the religious leaders of the day. The religious writings in the Mishnah, in terms of their interpretation of law, this is where it's been said. He says, you have heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not murder, and whoever murders will be in danger of the judgment. But I say to you that whoever is angry with his brother without a cause shall be in danger of the judgment. And whoever says to his brother, Rakah, shall be in danger of the council. But whoever says, you fool, shall be in danger of hellfire. Therefore, if you bring your gift to the altar, and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go your way. First, be reconciled to your brother, and then come and offer your gift. Agree with your adversary quickly while you're on your way with him, lest your adversary deliver you to the judge. The judge hand you over to the officer, and you be thrown into prison. Surely I say to you, you will by no means get out of there until you have paid the last penny. And so, hatred is a violation of the 6th commandment, which prohibits murder. The Mishnaic interpretation of the 6th commandment was that only the act of murder violated the commandment. Jesus said, in contrast, that even hateful or angry thoughts towards someone else is viewed by God as a violation of the 6th commandment. And so Jesus illustrates this truth by emphasizing the need for maintaining fellowship with one's brother. Again, in this context, probably another Jew. In fact, a proper heart attitude and relationship to one's brother is even more important than going through all of the correct temple responsibilities. And so this reveals, again, that God has an unchanging standard of righteousness where he not only looks at externals, but he also evaluates the heart. We see the same concept communicated in Romans 2:16, where it says he's going to judge the secrets of men by Jesus Christ. And so, again, although this is specifically addressed to convince Jesus's audience of God's standard of righteousness, this is also a transdispensational principle found in the age of grace. We go to 1 John 4:20 through 21, and it also says that if you hate your brother, that you are a murderer. And so God sees those two as equivalent. So that was the first faulty interpretation of the rabbis as it relates to God's standard of righteousness. The second one is found in verses 27 through 30, and this has to do with the command not to commit adultery. And Jesus again starts with, you have heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you, so you have heard that it was said, but I say to you, and you're going to see that pattern here. But I say to you that whoever looks at a woman to lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to sin, pluck it out, cast it from you, for it is more profitable for you that one of your members perish than for your whole body to be cast into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and cast it from you. For it is more profitable for you that one of your members perish than for your whole body to be cast into hell. And so lustful thoughts, Jesus says, is a violation of the seventh commandment, which prohibits adultery. The Mishnaic interpretation of the seventh commandment was that only the physical act of adultery violated the command. But Jesus said that even lustful thoughts that only God may be able to see is just as much a violation of the seventh commandment as actually engaging in a physical adulterous act. And so Jesus illustrates this truth by using these two hyperbolic statements, again, designed to make a point. He's making a point by overstating it. Again, notice the use of the right eye and the right hand, and both of these represent the best eye or the best hand, and it's basically an extreme statement used to emphasize the importance of walking in God's righteousness and not some standard that we have devised for ourselves. And like the first principle that we looked at, God's righteousness does not change throughout the course of dispensations. And so this is clearly a transdispensational principle that we find in the age of grace. In 1 Thessalonians 4, 3 through 5, reads this as it relates to lust. 1 Thessalonians 4, 3 through 5, for this is the will of God, your sanctification, that you should abstain from sexual immorality, that each of you should know how to possess his own vessel in sanctification and honor, not in passion of lust, like the Gentiles who do not know God. And so you see the same concept, the same standard of righteousness communicated across the ages, that God is not just interested in an external compliance, but also an internally and properly motivated response. The third interpretation that Jesus is going to address that was a faulty interpretation of the rabbis in his day had to do with divorce. And verses 31 through 32 read this, furthermore, it has been said, whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. But I say to you that whoever divorces his wife for any reason except sexual immorality causes her to commit adultery. And whoever marries a woman who is divorced commits adultery. Any cause divorce was a very popular concept in Jesus' day, but it's a violation of the seventh commandment. Again, the rabbinical interpretation here would be that a man could divorce his wife for any reason. But we learn here that divorce in God's eyes is the moral equivalent of adultery. And so for Jesus's hearers, this was an everyday occurrence. They'd seen this, and there weren't really any major ramifications, and yet it still fit within the interpretation of the Mosaic Law. And it's just kind of a misunderstanding, I believe, a misunderstanding of the heart of Deuteronomy 24. And let's go to Deuteronomy 24, and this is kind of the passage that was cited by those promoting an any cause divorce. But Deuteronomy 24, 1 through 4, when a man takes a wife and marries her, and it happens that she finds no favor in his eyes because he has found some uncleanness in her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce, puts it in her hand, and sends her out of his house. When she has departed from his house and goes and becomes another man's wife, if the latter husband detests her and writes her a certificate of divorce, puts it in her hand, and sends her out of the house, or if the latter husband dies who took her as his wife, then her former husband who divorced her must not take her back to be his wife after she has been defiled. For that is an abomination before the Lord, and you shall not bring sin on the land which the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance. And so many people took that as a teaching that, okay, well, yeah, you can just divorce your wife for any cause, but basically just don't remarry her. And really, it was just providing a description. And this is what Jesus brings out here and elsewhere, that actually elsewhere, where he says that it's due to the hardness of their hearts that God allowed these things. But in most cases, we've got to understand that when Jesus is talking here, that a divorced woman would likely remarry another husband, often for her own security. And Jesus basically said, if you divorce a woman, you're virtually causing her to commit adultery, because she would normally have to remarry to provide for her needs. And so Jesus again showed how serious this was in the sight of God according to his heart behind this law Again, just interpreting the law according to true righteousness, not according to man's standards. And we'll pick up there in verse 33 when we go into our next section.